Now we wrap up by looking at Asia, and we're going to start with India, then we're going to pivot into China and some of the issues or things that we've seen from China that, give us a little bit of a pause as we head into a Biden presidency, and what is that going to do for relations between the U.S. and China, which to me, if you've read our stuff, watched what we've been doing, it's not, we don't see a big change with a president, with a Biden presidency versus a Trump in terms of just the kind of the trajectory. Given the commentary, it might be a bit more political, but it in terms of the actual actions, we don't see that changing. The rhetoric might soften, but the actual impacts will still be real. Now, the one thing that we want to talk about first is India exports and imports, because this is something big where they missed estimates, where exports actually fell 8.7%, imports fell 13.3%. And we were expecting to see exports actually increase. And this is what we keep talking about, and it's finally starting to show up in the numbers, is the export market is very crowded right now. And we've talked about how China has looked to take market share, but it's taking market share of a shrinking pie, and that's being reverberated in the export market. So imports have been falling around the world. That's been very standard, while exports have increased. And there's a certain point in time where you still need imports in order to semi-finished goods, domestic demand. And India being down this much, South Korea, Japan continuing to be down as much, because we'll talk about Japan as well. The imports continued to be lackluster, and eventually the exports were going to catch up. And now we're starting to see that exponentially in terms of just the pain coming in, because we've now maxed out. We've now started to see rejuvenation in inventories, which just means that you're not filling inventory, you're starting to get back to normal, which is slowing down exports. And if we're not seeing an increase in imports anywhere else, or increase in domestic demand, i.e. India and China, that is going to be a bigger problem, where it comes down to the supply recovery versus the demand recovery that we've been talking about. Supply recoveries provide a nice shot in the arm, but you need a real demand recovery to see a sustainable move. And we just haven't seen a real demand side recovery in the US, in Asia, in Europe, which again is starting to show in some of these export numbers. And it'll continue to be that way as we go through the remainder of the year, and especially into next year, because the imports remain low, remain negative, which means that the locals aren't buying, and then at the same time the industrials aren't buying because their exports are slowing. So if your exports are slowing, you're going to have to slow down industrial production, you're going to have to slow down manufacturing, you're going to have more stuff in inventory that you can use to fill new orders. So even if your orders go up, you're still going to have to work through inventory to get to the other side, again causing some of the perpetual delays. Now, a vaccine could lead to an unwinding of savings in India. This is a net positive when we start talking about demand functions, because they do have India has purchased enough vaccines to inoculate 85% of their populace, which should provide some movement back into the system, as we see savings in India has increased by a large percentage. The question is going to be how many people have to get vaccinated? How quickly can they disseminate it? Because India is a very big, very crowded place, and it's very difficult to move stuff around on a logistical level. So how quickly can we see this disseminate? And does it really spark some kind of movement and get people interested in trying to spend their money? And that's why when we look at industrial recovery, the industrial recovery lost momentum. Why? Because exports are down, imports are down. So you're going to have less stuff to build, less raw materials to use, because you're going to use inventory to feed the beast, which is why electricity consumption dropped. Expressways, cement, steel, all of these things are running in a negative or below pre-pandemic levels, as we see this just inherent softness move abroad, move across the broad economy within India, and the reason why we talk about this is because India is a huge demand center for oil. It's expected to be the growth engine to kind of get us and continue to see additional oil come off the floating market, out of the market, kind of to pull some of this glut in. And these are the headwinds that are going to continue, especially as the central bank is limited to additional stimulus that they can do. The government is limited to additional stimulus they can do, which is because of inflation. Now, food inflation dropped but remains elevated, and this gives a great breakdown. So CPI came in below expectations, but still, it came in below expectations, but well above target. And that's the concern, because food and beverage, like you can see the cost to actual people. Now, fuel and lighting has gotten cheaper. Why? Because people aren't buying as much. This comes down back to refined product demand. Are people really not buying as much, or are they doing less? Clothing, housing, miscellaneous, food, fats and oils, vegetables, all of those things that people are actually buying remain elevated in price. And again, coming back down to the amount of money being spent on food, as we've talked about with just what percentage of every dollar is being spent on food continues to increase. And if you're spending more on food, you're spending less on stuff, coming back to the demand recovery versus a supply recovery. The local demand just isn't there and remains under pressure, which is going to be an overarching problem if we want to start to see some normalization. Now, as we pivot to China, I thought this was an important chart because it shows the labor productivity growth is continuing to fall. Now, it obviously falls as productivity increases, it's not something that can perpetually happen. You reach a point of a perpetuity where you really can't see or grow that much unless you get some huge increase in computing capacity or some sort of new way or innovation of doing something. But we've seen that come out. Now we're back to the economies of scale and that benefit that you get of giving a lopsided deal to China goes away. You're not gaining the same amount in productivity going to China as you have in the past. So that's why we're starting to see this pivot. Southeast Asia is now more interesting. India is more interesting. Other areas become more interesting because China's still it's far away. Let's be fair. It's on a geographical level. It is difficult to get there and back depending on which way you're going, the route you have to take, whether it's across the Pacific, through the Strait of Malacca, into other areas. There are other spots that are closer to the mouth of the strait or still have access to cross the Pacific. These are things that are coming into play when we look at China losing a certain amount of their infrastructure, or I should say manufacturing prowess, as companies look to diversify and adjust their supply chains. And this isn't lost on China. Like, they have a lot of things, especially ones that we're going to talk about, that are policies that they're looking to create to try to adjust that. Now, November econ data. So what are the headlines? So now they're just having fun with it. Retail sales rose by 5%, up from 4.3% year over year. Estimate was 5%. Fixed asset investment increased 2.6% year over year in the first 11 months of the year, up from 1.8% growth in January to October period. Again, expectations were 2.6%. Value-added output at industrial firms rose 7% year over year last month versus 6.9% growth in October. Again, expectations 7%. So land transactions were down 15.7% year over year. So we're starting to see some cracks in different areas. And that's the interesting thing, is there's some spots that are showing bigger pressure because we're seeing the PBOC wanting to soften some of their leniency. They're trying to get rid of some of the shadow banking that accelerated during the period of trying to borrow. And we're starting to see that pressure mount in other areas. Now, the other thing that the Chinese Beige Book I thought had a funny quote, because we've talked about this previously. We've been highlighting on how China's been restriking 2019 numbers, and in this back to normal. So when we look at the numbers versus estimates, we have to recognize that 2019 fixed asset investments adjusted in order to get to the growth levels they're talking about. So as Chinese Beige Book says, literally trillions vanished from government data in October and even more disappeared in November. If revisions eviscerating the 2019 baseline are needed, shouldn't you also revise down 2019 GDP? We continue to see this baseline in 2019 get taken down to show a much better year-over-year growth projection. And this is where we continue to see some of the shortfall in terms of, well, how good is the actual economy? What does the rejuvenation actually look like? And this is when now we take the things that I read out. Now let's put them on a chart. When you look at the value add on the industry, that is back to essentially pre-pandemic levels. Now, 8 months in, I should say at this point, 11 months. Let's be fair. 8 months into the recovery, they're still not back above pre-COVID levels. So even with this restrike of the year over year, we're still not back to where we were on a growth level, which is why, excuse me, we remain concerned about what is real, what is actual, because you see the data points, and then you see the ship flows, and then you see the actual demand internally, and they're each telling a different story, and it's hard to get a pulse of which is the real story, which one will take hold over the longer term, because, and this is why I come back to, you have to listen to what the CCP say. What are they driving home? And the fact that they're driving home the dual circulation strategy and trying to drive demand generators, that is the problem. That is where to focus of where is the local purchasing happening? Why are they so concerned about the consumer? And that's where I think the bigger issue resides. So if you look at retail sales, which is the orange line, you can see it's really flattened out. And if we start to go through some of the specifics of why that's concerning, I think it'll be a bit clearer. So when we look at the Chinese business cycle upswelling, the idea is that it still has steam. So we get debt impulses are starting to flatten out, but activity indicators are telling me or showing based on this chart that it should go higher. But now let's look at retail sales in November. So Double 11 online shopping carnival, that happened from November 1st to the 11th. It was longer than last year, 26% higher than last year. So let's just break this apart. So it was longer than last year, so it lasted 10 days. The reported sales were $75.3 billion, which is 26% higher than last year and the highest rate of growth in the past 3 years. Now, this year's Double 11 festival lasted longer than previous years and consumer demand was fully released. Now, they followed that with a Double 12 shopping festival, which wrapped up this past Saturday. The pace appears to have been a distant second, perhaps even third, as it came and went without much hype and much spending. So again, we're starting to see this slowdown. So they essentially filled everything. So November numbers look better because they had great sales, great promotions, great everything. So for the merchants, the two biggest sale promotions are Double 11 and June 6/18. They came and went. June's was disappointing. Double 11 was strong, but Double 12 didn't do anything. And in view of the economic situation this year, merchants' cash flow may not be sufficient for them. The ratio of their investment and output during Double 12 would definitely not be as high as that is in Double 11. So you had a twofold. The demand never showed up, and merchants didn't really participate because they didn't have the ability to do so. And this is where the Chinese government is trying to say, look, we're trying to finance where the business cycle is going to upswing because we're going to push debt and money into it, giving a positive debt impulse, but the demand isn't there on the consumer level. So if we see exports and imports slowing globally, can we really see the Chinese market really maintain their export push? Because it's going to be very costly to do so, which is what we broke down last week with the amount of GDP that needs to be spent to maintain their export level at the rates it currently is. So now let's look at this in a different way. So what are some policies that we're looking at? And in the meeting last week, the Polyturbo coined a new term, demand side reform. So we know that. We know the demand side reform. The demand side reform is going to be the dual circulation system. Now, to go along with the supply side reforms that were long promised. Now, the supply side reforms is where we get concerned, because this is where communism starts to take hold and we start to see things breaking out in a negative light. And why are they doing this? Because as part of that is called for solutions to the income gap, a flawed social security system, and unreasonable property prices. So we saw property prices coming down. We knew investment in property prices falling 15.7%. We now have the renewed vigor of income gap, which is going to be the movement between incomes, which we all know how that ends. And we now see them sanctioning Alibaba and other big tech companies they sanctioned Alibaba 500,000 renminbi, and it's minor, but it's back to 2017. So it's essentially a shot across the bow saying you are not above the party. Be careful. And we're going to start to see this tightening as they look to take some of the income from these billionaires and millionaires in the country and redistribute. Now, although analysts and the foreign press have still largely ignored it, I expect that demand-side reform will be an important part of the Central Economic Conference later in December. This is also going to be a much bigger side of the equation in terms of where is this going to go, how is this going to transition as we go forward. So when we take all this and the bigger component is demand-side reform is not about just boosting demand with ever more investment, but about reforming the structural and institutional impediments to demand. Again, what are they identifying as the impediment to demand? Income. They want to take income from others, give it to the people, and allow them to purchase, again, that redistribution of wealth, which is going to become a much bigger issue over time. So the two themes that stand out to me, supply side structural reform, which is now calling for demand side reform to reduce income inequality, improve logistics, and boost consumption, but strengthen antitrust efforts and the prevention of the disorderly expansion of capital. Just look at the monopolies, just look at the big companies and be fearful of how the government is going to look at those and look to sanction them going forward. And they also deliberated work rules with the local party organizations, continuing efforts to encourage intra-party democracy, promoting the party's democratic centralism, improving effective participation by party members, and respecting the democratic rights of party members. Everything's about the party. They want to increase influence into the party to really kind of drive home where this is going to go over time. And this is a big problem because when we look at President Xi and what he has done, he has essentially rewritten 70 or at least changed into his liking 70 to 80% of the party's bylaws and movements to be more focused, more communist at heart. And he's morphed them in different ways. And now let's look at some of the big focal points. So President Xi then put forward 10 requirements for pursuing a holistic approach to national security. This is where we start looking at U.S. relations, Australian relations. What does this look like? So accepting the party's absolute leadership over national security. Again, defaulting to the party, giving everything to the party is paramount for buy-in, which is what Xi is pushing for. Developing an expansive security concept covering regime security, national interest, and economic security. Again, now linking them all together as the U.S. and other nations have gone after Huawei, have gone after and sanctioned multiple everything from Sinopec to all the way down, because there is a fear in terms of how is the party being utilized, what is going to happen with their economic prowess abroad. And that's why we look at prioritizing political security. Again, we've seen this become a much bigger issue, mobilizing the public to help promote national security, placing equal emphasis on development and security. Again, they want to create dual circulation system, increase Made in China 25, increase Belt and Road Initiative, vertical integration. Now, increase local purchasing, again, income and inequality, to try to live within themselves and push away some of the benefit or some of the pressures they can get from other countries. And that's why moving away from SWIFT or the sweep vehicle that comes from U.S. banks, getting away from U.S. dollars, mitigating against what they see as the coming risk as the trade war only continues to ramp up, not only with the U.S., but other nations. And ensuring both traditional and non-traditional security, obvious, improving the state's capacity of diffusing national security issues. Hong Kong, Taiwan, these are directions in terms of what is happening there, advancing international cooperation on common security, which is obviously what they're trying to do, harnessing technologies to boost national security. We had a whole show on that called Chinese Communism Rising, which is something to really look at, in building loyal and capable national security enforcement apparatus. Loyal and capable people to enforce what they're seeing. Again, this is all things that we have to look at, because when you look at communist regimes or authoritative regimes, they either look at what they've done and say, look, we did this wrong, we need to open up more, or they blame the people and say, you guys are the reason why it didn't work, and they crack down and they increase authoritativeness, they increase control. And we can see Xi is going that route. He is increasing control. He is increasing his movement, and they've come out and said that national planners, state level planners, do a better job than the market. That is, they've said it. They've started to put national party members at top levels, saying that national planning is the way to go going forward. And this is something to watch, because if you look, national security is working its way into all forms of the economy, and it's going to become a much bigger issue over time. So China's overseas lending collapses. Now, collapsing is a strong word, but we're seeing that they're adjusting. They're pulling inward to try to mitigate against the fears abroad in terms of what is the collateral, what is the benefit, because we continue to see collateral falling away. Their treasuries continue to decline, and as their treasuries decline in terms of their holdings, they have more cash on hand, which they're using to use as collateral against current holdings to strengthen balance sheets. So overseas lending would naturally fall, especially because they've invested in emerging markets and frontier markets that are struggling more than most, not only with just before this when trade was already slowing, but now exponentially more so with the pain that we're seeing with COVID. Now, when we take this and we look at state-owned versus private investment, again, state-owned investment remains the main driver, and private investment continues to, it's increasing, but at a much slower pace. And this comes full circle to the renewed focus on state-owned, state-operated enterprises and a movement away from the private investment. Now, people that move there with PhDs, that came to America or other places to get education, are they going to be okay with having some of their technology, some of their patents claimed as state-owned? And I don't know. They've talked about trying to increase patent laws and increase the openness to incentivize people to come back. But now that they're back, do they say, now you can't leave? Like, do they lock down overall and you become a captive of your own state? These are things that we don't know, but are worth looking at as we see strife and politics and problems continuing to arise in between China and other nations. Now, let's look at Australia. So let's look at top Australian goods exports to China. Total goods exported remain very strong because 86.2 billion of what, and when we look at iron ore and then exports including iron ore continues to be the massive driver. But within China, the steel entities are saying like, you need to step in on price. You need to step in on price because iron ore prices are out of control, coal prices are out of control. And again, this is now we're starting to see what is inflation going to look like? What is this going to do to pricing? How are people going to continue to buy? If the dollar continues to weaken, it's now more expensive to buy stuff from China and prices are going up with raw materials going up. Again, these are things that we were looking at. And if the state steps in, we're already seeing tax revenues falling. We've had tax cuts. We've had more tax cuts. 2020 is going to see additional tax cuts with more being talked about in 2021. They don't have the tax base to do that because a lot of these projects that were initiated with debt in 2016 are being financed with tax revenue. So tax revenue is already being used to finance debt that they shouldn't have taken or was done just to prop up the economy. And now the benefits that have to get pushed down in the redistribution aspect is going to become a bigger issue over time. And that's why when we look at peak China infrastructure, the credit impulse, like as we've been saying, has been pushed higher, but the Chinese SOE fixed investment is continuing to fall. SOE fixed growth has already softened in the last couple of months, and the credit impulse exceeds 9% of China's GDP, levels where policy typically starts to clamp down, which is why we've seen the PBOC talk about we will start to slow things down. We saw it in real estate. We're starting to see it in lending. These are things that are pivoting, which is going to pull back some of the growth that we've seen, and we should start to see a mitigation against additional purchases and additional movements, which comes full circle to, can China continue to buy oil at the levels they're buying? I'm going to go with the answer of no. Now, the state advances on the world stage, financial SOEs, non-financial SOEs. You can see that the Chinese state sector share of global GDP continues to move higher on an aggregated basis with financial SOEs and just state-owned enterprises. And this has been a big thorn in everyone's side when we talk about China, their backdrop in the WTO, their backdrop in terms of giving subsidies that then unfairly compete against other entities, which is why we're seeing more and more sanctions from the US, Europe, Australia, Japan, India against executives and these financial institutions for essentially just dumping and other types of illegal practices based on WTO laws. Now, with that being said, we're going to round it out with Japan. And here you can see Japanese numbers have essentially flattened out. Now, they're slightly below estimates, and you might think, why China into Japan? Because China and Japan have a natural competition where China or Xi is looking to amend for the century of embarrassment. And Japan is at the forefront of that in their eyes. So now when you look at the composite, you can see that things are starting to slow as we talked about with exports, with imports, and the BOJ continues to step in. The business activity level has flatlined. We're seeing PMI manufacturing slightly better, but coming in at 49.7. So, composite PMI coming in at 48 as the pressure continues to mount overall with services being slow, manufacturing slowly gaining, but on the manufacturing level, we have to, again, look at exports and imports. So when we look at exports and imports, we had a big miss. So Japanese exports went down 4.2%. Imports, while they rised, they were supposed to be only down 8%. Instead, they were down 11%. Exports were supposed to be positive. Again, these are the economics and the metrics that we're looking at to see a general slowdown in trade, which is reverberating through the system. Again, giving us pause when we look at expectations for 2021 GDP. It is, with these kind of economics, it's very difficult to see a big increase or a sustainable recovery when we start to look out and start to figure out, well, how is this going to go overall, especially with Asia, because Asia has such a big hold given the size of the economies. India and China are meant to be the ones that save us from with more oil demand, more refined product demand, more growth for business. And we're seeing more pressure with China locking down, India slowing down, and Japan and South Korea under their own problems slowing as well. And just to round it out, just because, Turkey came out, and this is the official sanctions that the U.S. has given Turkey for their launch of the S-400, which was what we told them not to do because they are part of NATO. They're not allowed to use the S-400. But this was a symbolic sentiment because when Libya signed the ceasefire, Russia and Turkey were on opposite sides. They signed the agreement. They let the agreement be signed, and then Turkey the same day turned around and test fired the S-400 system. They have continued to work together in Armenia, Azerbaijan. So this is just a shot across the bow that imposing sanctions is going to increase. Pressure is going to increase in Turkey. The Turkish banks are very much exposed to Europe. Again, coming full circle back to issues in Europe and the domino effects that we continue to see linking everything back together. These are the pressures that we see. These are the concerns that we have. I know this is a long segment. This is going to be my favorite segment because we covered a lot of topics. But again, these are the pressures that are mounting on a macroeconomic, geopolitical level that just limits the real economic growth. Given we're at 3,700, we're going to probably finish at all-time highs in the U.S. But this is the reality of which we're and this can be ignored for a long time. We've already been ignoring it, but at some point, gravity is real, and we will see a pullback to actual economic growth to try to support some of these fundamentals and these to have some of the fundamentals just support some of these lofty multiple expansions. So thanks again for watching. Tomorrow we have our Primary Vision Frac Spread show. I know everyone's excited, and hopefully everyone weathered the blizzard in the Northeast, and we look forward to talking to you. And we have an exciting lineup for next week. So stay tuned. And again, I'm Mark Rossano, founder and CEO of C6 Capital Holdings, coming to you from Primary Vision Network.